Welcome to Talk Treatises.
Thanks for having me back.
You know, I was thinking, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Oh, sure.
It's like looking at the blueprints of an engine or something. Like you fall, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just, points a pen at it and says, there it is. That is the problem.
Right. It's totally binary, which honestly is something the human mind really craves.
Yeah.
We have this fundamental psychological need for things to be visible, categorized, and, well, neatly solved.
But then you step into the world of human society. You start looking at government, at why we obey laws, at why we form these incredibly aggressive political tribes.
Oh, yeah.
And suddenly that x-ray machine is completely broken. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just entirely murky.
Yeah, you really can't put a nation's political animosity into an MRI machine.
No, exactly. You can't.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And yet, if you look throughout history, we have desperately wanted to find a way to read those waters. We want to make the unpredictable chaos of human interaction predictable.
We want a science of society.
Exactly, a science of society.
Which brings us to why you're here with us today. And honestly, we are so glad you could pull up a chair and join us.
Always a pleasure.
And for you listening, consider yourself the third person at our table for what I promise is going to be a deeply rewarding intellectual exploration today. We are looking at a classic, truly groundbreaking 18th century philosophical text.
It's a heavy hitter.
It really is. We are exploring a work that attempts to do something staggeringly ambitious.
Yes.
I mean, it tries to apply the rigorous, cold, empirical, scientific method to the messy, chaotic worlds of human emotion, political factions, and government structures.
It's a monumental task.
Yeah.
And I think to truly understand the gravity of this text, you have to transport yourself back in time a bit.
Okay, set the stage for us.
Imagine you're living during the Scottish Enlightenment. This was a pivotal, almost breathless era in human history.
Because the world was changing so fast.
Right. The world was just starting to transition out of the exhausting, utterly devastating religious wars of the previous century.
Right, the 30 Years' War, all of that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Millions dead. So the old paradigm, the idea of divine right monarchies, where kings ruled with absolute authority because God supposedly ordained it directly, that idea was finally losing its iron grip on the European imagination.
People were just exhausted by the bloodshed. I mean, when millions of people die over abstract theological disputes, the survivors tend to start looking for a more grounded way to organize society.
Right, a practical way.
Yeah. Thinkers of this era were desperately trying to figure out how to anchor civilization in empirical reality. They wanted to know what actually makes a state function without relying on theology or superstition.
Or ancient myths. And out of that desperation comes the core thesis of the work we're unpacking today. If we had to distill this author's massive contribution down to one powerful paradigm-shifting sentence, it would be this. All government and social order, whether you're looking at a supposedly free democratic republic or a deeply despotic empire, rests entirely on human opinion.
Wow.
Yeah. And by understanding the underlying mechanics of human passions, politics can be reduced to a predictable science.
I mean, that is a massive claim.
It really is.
So the mission of our deep dive today is to deconstruct this framework piece by piece. We're going to explore how this author totally redefined human nature, how he took a look at what we would call blatant political corruption and somehow miraculously justified it as an engineering necessity.
That part is always controversial.
Oh, highly. And we'll get into how he analyzed the absolute madness of why we form factions and how he ultimately created the foundational blueprint for modern political science.
It's a journey that will fundamentally shift how you view the institutional structures around you right now. But before we get into the heavy machinery of the philosophy itself, we really need to understand the thinker who built it.
Yes, because his own life is practically a masterclass in his own theories.
It really is.
I find his biography so compelling because he is like the patron saint of late bloomers and career pivoters. Where does this thinker actually come from? Because he wasn't born into massive academic prestige, right?
No, not at all. He was born in 1711 in Edinburgh, Scotland, to a minor, though perfectly respectable family. His father was a Scottish laird.
Which means what exactly?
It essentially meant they had some land and some status, but certainly not limitless wealth. And his path was not as straight-lined to philosophical superstardom.
Right.
His early life was characterized by a series of deeply frustrating false starts. Because he was incredibly bright, his family initially tried to push him into the legal profession.
Classic parent move.
Exactly. They thought he was in his room diligently poring over heavy legal treatises, preparing for a sensible career. But he later admitted in his autobiography that he felt an insurmountable aversion to everything but the pursuits of philosophy and general learning.
So what was he actually doing in his room?
He was secretly devouring classical authors like Cicero and Virgil instead of studying property law.
Ah, the classic brilliant student who just flat out refuses to study the practical syllabus because he's too busy thinking about the universe.
Precisely. So obviously the legal career was a non-starter. Then, recognizing he needed to make a living, he made a brief, rather feeble attempt at commerce.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he traveled to Bristol to work with merchants. But a deeply introspective philosopher does not naturally thrive in the bustling, highly pragmatic world of 18th century mercantile trade.
I can imagine.
He found the scene completely unsuitable to his temperament and left after only a few months. So here he is in his early 20s. He has no profession. He has no real independent income, and he makes a radical, almost monastic decision.
What does he do?
He moves to rural France, specifically to La Flèche in Anjou, to live in extreme frugality. He essentially isolates himself to write a massive, comprehensive, philosophical treatise that he believes will revolutionize human thought.
You really have to admire the sheer audacity of it. I mean, a young guy in his 20s, basically unemployed, sitting in a room in France deciding he is going to write the definitive end-all be-all book on human nature.
The ambition was staggering, and the incredible thing is, he actually finished it. He poured his absolute soul into these volumes, outlining a completely new empirical approach to the human mind.
Okay, so he finishes it. How was it received?
When it was finally published, it was a colossal failure.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The author famously and somewhat tragically described it as having fallen dead-born from the press.
Dead-born from the press. Ouch.
It didn't even excite enough interest to make the religious zealots angry. It was just met with profound, echoing silence.
Which, if you're a writer or a creator of any kind, you know is the absolute worst possible reaction. You want them to cheer, or you want them to burn the book in the town square, because at least that means you struck a nerve. You don't want them to just yawn and ignore it.
It was devastating. But,
yeah.
And this is crucial, this failure is the crucible that formed his true genius. It didn't break him, it transformed his entire approach to communication.
How so?
He took a step back and realized that the problem wasn't necessarily his underlying ideas, it was his delivery. His massive treatise was incredibly dense, bogged down in complex epistemology and abstract metaphysics.
So people just couldn't read it.
Exactly. So he executed a brilliant pivot. Instead of writing impenetrable volumes for a tiny academic elite, he started writing sharp, witty, highly accessible essays designed for the educated public.
Ah. He recognized that the medium is part of the message. He basically became one of the world's first true public intellectuals.
He absolutely did. And this new format, the conversational essay, brought him immense runaway success. He gained the independent wealth he had always wanted. He later took on diplomatic roles, returning to France, where, ironically, he was now completely feted by high society.
That's amazing.
The great nobles, the intellectuals, and the leading ladies of the Paris salons practically fought to have the good philosopher at their dinner parties.
Talk about a turnaround.
Right. He went from a struggling, ignored young man in a drafty room to a figure who lived very comfortably, eventually hosting his own vibrant intellectual salon back in Edinburgh.
I love looking at that pivot because it brings up a really interesting question about how we consume complex ideas. It feels a bit like, a modern academic who writes a brilliant but totally unreadable 800-page textbook, sells 12 copies, and then decides to start a Substack or a viral blog, and suddenly they have millions of followers.
Yes, that's exactly the modern equivalent.
But my question is, did changing the medium to be more digestible compromise the actual strictness of his philosophy? I mean, by writing for the salons of Paris and the coffee houses of Edinburgh, did he water down his science of human nature?
That is a phenomenal question, and it strikes at the heart of his methodology. The answer is no. He didn't compromise the strictness. In fact, he refined its practical application.
Really?
Yeah. Think of it not as dumbing down his philosophy, but as distilling it. The heavy, abstract, metaphysical lifting was done in the failed treatise. The essays we're looking at today were his way of taking that complex psychological machinery and showing how it actually operates in the real world.
So applying it to daily life.
Right. how it applies to politics, to art, to economics, and to our daily interactions.
Yeah.
He realized that if his entire philosophy was built on the premise of understanding human nature, his own writing needed to appeal to human nature.
Right. A dense textbook doesn't move people.
Exactly. It doesn't engage their passions. A conversational, brilliantly argued essay does. He was, in effect, practicing his own science by adapting his style to fit the psychological reality of his readers.
Wow. He was using his profound understanding of human psychology to hack the 18th century publishing world.
Basically, yes.
Which leads us perfectly into the core mechanisms of his theory. Because to build a science of politics, to figure out how to engineer a stable society, he first had to establish the science of the individual mind.
Right.
If you want to build a bridge, you need to understand the physics of the steel and concrete. If you want to build a state, you need to understand the emotional physics of the citizen. So how do we process the world?
Well, he begins this exploration by looking closely at our emotional sensitivities. He draws a fascinating, a highly practical distinction in his text between what he calls a delicacy of passion and a delicacy of taste.
Let's really pull this apart because this distinction feels incredibly relevant today. What exactly is a delicacy of passion?
If you possess a delicacy of passion, you are essentially a hostage to circumstance.
Oof, a hostage.
Yeah. You are highly, painfully sensitive to the daily accidents of life. When something good happens, a minor career success, a compliment from a peer, a stroke of good luck, you are overjoyed, elevated completely beyond measure. You feel invincible.
Sounds nice, honestly.
It does. But when something bad happens, like a minor slight, a tiny professional failure, or rumor about you, you are completely destroyed. Your emotions are boisterous, volatile, uncontrollable, and entirely dependent on external events that you have absolutely no power over.
It's like being strapped into an emotional roller coaster where a total stranger is operating the controls. You're just along for the terrifying ride.
The text notes that while these people might occasionally experience much more lively enjoyments, they also suffer from infinitely more pungent sorrows. And let's face the reality of human existence. Great ecstatic pleasures are exceedingly rare, while minor irritations, annoyances, and setbacks are a daily constant.
Right. Traffic, stilled coffee, rude emails.
Exactly. Therefore, a person with a delicacy of passion is going to spend a vast majority of their life miserable. Furthermore, because their passions are so violently, easily triggered, they are prone to making imprudent, irreversible mistakes out of sudden bursts of anger or grief.
It's an exhausting, dangerous way to live. You're constantly reacting instead of acting. So what is his proposed cure for this volatility?
The cure is to actively cultivate a delicacy of taste.
Okay.
This involves developing a refined, educated appreciation for the liberal arts, for poetry, eloquence, history, music, and beauty. When you deliberately cultivate your taste, you are redirecting your natural emotional sensitivity away from the unpredictable drama of the real world and focusing it toward things that are structured, permanent, and under your control.
This is such a brilliant psychological pivot. Let me try an analogy here for you listening because this maps so perfectly onto modern life.
Go for it.
Having a delicacy of passion feels exactly like the phenomenon of doom scrolling on social media. You open the app and you are immediately handing over your emotional state to a chaotic feed. You let a trending outrage, a rude comment from a totally anonymous stranger, or just the manic news cycle completely dictate your mood for the rest of the day. You are at the absolute mercy of the algorithm.
That is a flawless modern translation of what he was describing. The algorithm thrives on your delicacy of passion.
Right. And cultivating a delicacy of taste is like making the conscious decision to put down the phone, step away from the chaotic feed, and curate a highly specific intellectual environment that brings lasting self-directed satisfaction.
Exactly.
It's choosing to spend an hour reading a classic novel or learning to actively listen to a complex piece of jazz or classical music, or deciding to have one deep, uninterrupted conversation with a close friend rather than screaming at 100 strangers online. It's taking that raw, vulnerable, emotional sensitivity and focusing it on something beautiful that won't betray you.
And the author explicitly points out how this cultivation of taste radically alters our social lives, too.
How so?
Delicacy of taste makes us highly selective about who we spend our time with. He borrows a wonderful analogy from a French writer, comparing human judgment to a clock.
A clock.
Yeah. An ordinary person, someone without refined taste, is like a basic clock that only tells the hours. It gives you the rough time, but misses the details. But a person who has cultivated a refined taste is like an elaborate, highly crafted watch that points out the precise minutes and seconds.
Oh, I love that.
They notice the subtle gradations in human character, the nuances of conversation, the depth of another person's intellect. Because their internal sensors are so finely tuned, they don't just hang out with the general crowd. They become somewhat indifferent to the noise of the masses, and instead form incredibly solid, deeply rewarding friendships with a select few who share that refinement.
So the superficial, gaiety of a bottle companion at a loud tavern is replaced by an enduring, unbreakable intellectual friendship. By actively training our aesthetic and intellectual taste, we actually calm our wild passions. We stop being leaves blown around by the wind of external events and become rooted trees.
And this exploration of our internal emotional mechanics leads right into his broader evaluation of human nature itself. The text tackles head-on a debate that has raged among philosophers and theologians for centuries: the dignity versus the meanness of human nature.
Right. Are humans fundamentally noble, exalted creatures standing just below the angels? Or are we inherently selfish, vain, contemptible, and driven only by base appetites?
It's the ultimate cynical versus optimistic view of humanity.
Yeah, you have thinkers like Thomas Hobbes arguing that life is nasty, brutish, and short because humans are essentially selfish monsters. Then you have idealists arguing we're divine sparks. Where does our author land in this polarized debate?
He introduces a vital, incredibly clarifying innovation to this debate.
Yeah.
He points out that the entire argument is mostly an illusion created by faulty comparisons.
Faulty comparisons.
Yeah. Whether you think human nature is magnificent or pathetic entirely depends on the measuring stick you're using.
Walk us through that. How does the measuring stick change the result?
Well, if we compare ourselves to the animal kingdom, we look absolutely incredible.
Right, sure.
We have foresight, we can map the movements of the stars, we build complex legal systems, we can trace causes and effects across centuries of history. Compared to a dog or a horse, man truly looks like a demigod of infinite capacity.
Okay, but what's the other measuring stick?
The other stick is if philosophers form an abstract, theoretical ideal of perfect wisdom, infinite patience, and flawless virtue, and if we compare our messy reality to that impossible standard, of course we look foolish, ignorant, and incredibly weak. He astutely notes that human beings fall much further short of perfect wisdom than animals fall short of us.
So the cynics who say human nature is terrible are rigging the game.
They are.
They are comparing us to a fictional ideal of perfection rather than looking at what we actually are within the natural world. It's like calling a bicycle a terrible invention because it can't fly to the moon.
Exactly. And he also warns against the trap of comparing one man to another to find wise men, because the term wise is inherently relative to the current population.
Right, it's a sliding scale.
Exactly. If magically the lowest functioning human on Earth suddenly became as brilliant as Sir Francis Bacon, we wouldn't suddenly say everyone is a genius. We would just raise our internal standard of what constitutes wisdom. And we'd still look around and say, there are very few truly wise men in the world.
Because we adapt to the new baseline.
It operates exactly like beauty. We only call someone beautiful because their features stand out from the average. If every single person on Earth were equally gorgeous, the standard would instantly shift and we'd still find a way to rank people.
That is a deeply perceptive insight into human psychology. We are constantly moving the goalposts on ourselves.
We really are.
But what about the specific accusation of human selfishness? Because there was a strong movement of thinkers, the egoists, who argued that every single good deed is just disguised selfishness.
Right.
They argued that even when you donate to charity or help a friend in need, you are only doing it to feel good about yourself or to buy a good reputation. It's all just calculated vanity.
The author, aggressively, and I think brilliantly, dismantles that specific cynicism. His defense of human virtue is one of the most clever arguments in the text. He takes vanity, the very trait the cynics point to, and flips it on its head.
How does he do that?
Well, the cynics say, look at that philanthropist. They only built that hospital because they are vain and wanted their name on the building and the praise of the public. The author says, okay, let's accept that they are vain, but think about the logical implication of that. Why would we seek praise for being virtuous if we didn't inherently value virtue in the first place?
Oh, wow. That is a spectacular rhetorical move.
Isn't it? If human beings didn't have a natural hardwired love for virtue, if we didn't genuinely admire generosity, courage, and kindness, then the public wouldn't offer any praise for it. And if the public didn't praise it, the vain person wouldn't bother doing it.
That makes perfect sense.
The very fact that we are vain about our good deeds proves that our society deeply, genuinely values good deeds. He argues that trying to reduce everything like friendship, public spirit, or maternal love to just a complex, twisted form of self-love is a gross abuse of language.
Right, you're just redefining words at that point.
Exactly. If you deeply love your children and you happily spend your hard-earned money on their education rather than spending it on a luxury vacation for yourself, calling that act selfishness simply because seeing your children succeed brings you internal joy is twisting the definition of the word selfish until it loses all meaning.
If I am tracking this correctly, the cynic says, you only gave that money to your friend because the act of giving gave you a secret psychological pleasure, therefore you are selfish. And the author replies, you have the causality backwards. The virtuous passion, my genuine love for my friend, produces the pleasure. The love doesn't arise from the pleasure. I feel pleasure in doing a good deed because I love my friend. I don't love my friend merely as a tool for the sake of generating pleasure.
You have nailed the exact distinction. It is a subtle, elegant, philosophical maneuver that rescues human nature from total bleak cynicism. It acknowledges that we are driven by passions and internal feelings, but it proves that some of those passions are genuinely noble and oriented toward others. He grounds virtue not in some divine command, but in observable human psychology.
So we've mapped the architecture of the individual mind. We know we're driven by passions. We can refine those passions through taste. We're constantly judging ourselves through subjective comparisons. And we possess a natural, if sometimes complicated, inclination toward virtue.
Correct.
Now, if you're listening, think about how difficult it is just to manage your own mind on a Tuesday.
Oh, tell me about it.
Right. How on earth do you take millions of these emotionally driven, subjective, highly sensitive individuals and organize them into a stable, functioning nation state?
This is the great transition in his philosophy, and it is where he makes his most radical, world-changing claim. Politics may be reduced to a science.
I really want to pause on that phrase. To call politics a science in the 18th century implies you believe it has laws, like the physics of gravity or the certainty of mathematics.
And that is precisely the level of certainty he is aiming for. He argues that the stability, prosperity, and freedom of a state rely almost entirely on its institutional form, the structural design of its constitution, and not on the moral character of the specific men running it.
Wait, really? Not on the moral character?
Yes. He fundamentally rejects the ancient, highly moralistic idea that a good government is simply a government run by good, virtuous people, and a bad government is one run by bad people.
I guess because relying on human beings to consistently be good, selfless saints, is a catastrophic strategy for national security.
It is a recipe for inevitable collapse. If a free Republican government only functioned properly when every single one of its elected leaders was perfectly honest, immune to bribery, and entirely dedicated to the public good, it would be an absurd, impossible system. Human nature guarantees that will never happen.
Right.
The author writes that consequences almost as general and certain as the mathematical sciences can be deduced from the specific forms of government, and like a good scientist, he uses vast amounts of historical data to prove it.
What kind of data?
He looks at the Roman Republic. When Rome expanded its massive empire, it kept its ancient voting system, which allowed the localized city tribes living within Rome itself to carry all the political votes. They never instituted a representative system for the vast, far-flung territories they conquered.
So all the power was still concentrated in the city of Rome, even though the empire was huge.
Exactly. And the result? It was structurally, mathematically inevitable. The ambitious politicians simply bribed the localized city mobs with free corn and entertainment. Armed slaves were introduced into the voting squares to intimidate rivals, and the whole majestic republic collapsed into the bloody tyranny of the Caesars.
So it wasn't just individual bad actors.
Right. It wasn't just that Caesar or Marius were bad men. The institutional design was structurally doomed to produce anarchy once the empire reached a certain size.
The machine was fundamentally built to shake itself apart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He provides another brilliant comparative analysis. The Venetian nobility versus the Polish nobility.
Okay, let's hear it.
In Venice, the nobility possessed absolute power, but they held it as a single, legally united body, a council. No individual Venetian noble had absolute, unchecked power over the laws or over individual citizens.
So they had to work together.
Yes, because their power was collective, they were forced to compromise, and they preserved a remarkable degree of internal peace and stability for centuries.
And Poland.
But look at Poland at the time. In Poland, every individual nobleman had distinct, hereditary, almost absolute authority over his own vassals and his own lands. Their parliament operated on the liberum veto.
What is the liberum veto?
It meant a single noble could explode the entire legislative session. If one noble voted no, the whole session was over. The power wasn't united, it was deeply fractured. And what was the scientifically predictable outcome? Endless private feuds, brutal animosities, foreign manipulation, and the utter ruin of the Polish state.
Wow.
He argues you could predict the outcome a priori just by looking at the blueprints of the institutional design, regardless of whether the Polish nobles were highly educated or the Venetian nobles were personally cruel. The structure dictates the destiny.
Which brings us to a concept that I think is one of the most fascinating and counterintuitive pieces of advice in the entire text. It's the famous knave maxim.
Yes. The text lays down a foundational rule for political engineering. It states that in contriving any system of government and in fixing the checks and controls of the Constitution, every single man must be supposed a knave who is acting entirely for his own private interest.
Okay, let me stop you there because we really need to reconcile this. Every man must be supposed a knave. That sounds incredibly dark and cynical.
It does.
Especially right after we just spent 15 minutes discussing how he defended human virtue and explicitly argued that we aren't completely selfish. Is this philosopher just wildly contradicting himself from one chapter to the next?
It looks like a contradiction, but it's actually a brilliant psychological paradox. He explicitly, openly acknowledges that this maxim is false, in fact.
Wait, false in fact?
Yeah. He says most men are not absolute knaves in their private lives. In fact, he observes that men are generally much more honest, kind, and trustworthy in their private domestic lives than they are in public office.
Okay, that tracks with reality.
But, he argues, the maxim must be treated as absolutely true in politics. Why? Because of group psychology. When men act in a group in a political faction, a corporate board, or a senate, the internal check of individual honor is dangerously diluted.
Oh, like mob mentality for politicians.
Precisely. An individual might feel guilty stealing from a neighbor, but a politician is routinely cheered by his party for doing something utterly ruthless if it advances their common political interest. The party covers the guilt.
Right.
Therefore, when you are an architect designing a government, you cannot build the load-bearing walls on the flimsy hope of human goodness. You must build a structure assuming every single politician will eventually try to steal as much power and wealth as humanly possible.
So you just expect the worst.
Exactly. A wise constitution takes that insatiable, inevitable human ambition and channels it through a rigorous system of checks and balances into serving the public good.
So the goal isn't to magically make politicians better people. The goal is to design a labyrinth where the only way the rat can get the cheese of private power is by accidentally turning the wheel that grinds the corn for the public. You pit one knave's ambition directly against another knave's ambition so they block each other from becoming tyrants.
Exactly. If your political system relies on the ruler being a saint, you have absolutely no security at all. You just have a ticking time bomb.
That is just brilliant, unsentimental engineering. But here is where the text pivots from mechanics to something deeply existential. He looks beneath the checks and balances, beneath the voting systems, to the true, ultimate foundation of this machinery. He writes about the fundamental illusion of power.
This might be the single most profound, paradigm-shifting realization in the entire work. The author takes a step back and asks a disarmingly simple question. How is it that the massive multitudes of humanity are governed by such a tiny few?
I mean, it's a good question.
Look at any nation in history. The everyday citizens mathematically outnumber the kings, the presidents, the police forces, and the standing armies by an absolutely massive margin. Physical force is always inherently on the side of the governed. So why on earth do the masses submit?
It's the ultimate question of civilization. Why doesn't the massive crowd just overrun the tiny palace every single day before breakfast?
The author's answer is chillingly, beautifully simple. All government, everywhere, is founded solely on opinion.
Opinion.
Just opinion. Even the most brutal, terrifyingly despotic tyrant, an emperor of ancient Rome or a modern dictator, cannot rule by pure physical force because at the end of the day, he is only one biological human being. He only rules because his personal guards, his generals, his secret police hold an opinion in their minds that it is in their interest to obey him. And the wider public holds an opinion that they should not rise up.
But wait, if we accept that premise, if government is essentially just a massively multiplayer shared psychological state, just an opinion, doesn't that make the state terrifyingly, precariously fragile?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. It feels like the concept of a fiat currency. A $100 bill is, scientifically speaking, just a piece of paper with some ink on it. It only has purchasing power because we all collectively, simultaneously hallucinate that it has value.
That's a great comparison.
Or think of a massive stock market bubble. The valuation holds together perfectly. Everyone is rich on paper until the exact millisecond that people stop believing the numbers are real, and then it evaporates instantly. What happens to a government when the hallucination breaks?
When the hallucination breaks, the government dissolves. Instantly. Doesn't matter how thick the palace walls are. The author breaks the shared hallucination down into two distinct types of opinion that keep the machinery running.
What are they?
First is the opinion of interest, which is the general pragmatic sense among the public that the current government is advantageous to them, that it protects their property, keeps the roads safe, and maintains order. If the government fails to do this, the opinion of interest drops.
Okay. And the second?
Second is the opinion of right, which is the deep-seated psychological belief that the rulers have a legitimate moral claim to hold power, often based on antiquity, long-standing traditions, or constitutional law.
So legitimacy.
Right. If a government manages to lose both of those opinions in the minds of the masses, all the guns, tanks, and fortress walls in the world will not save it. Because the people holding the guns, the soldiers on the walls, will also stop believing, and they will simply lower their weapons.
That is a staggering, almost vertigo-inducing way to view power. It's not a physical object you can hold. It's entirely cognitive. It exists nowhere but in the minds of the citizens.
And applying this cold, scientific, mechanistic lens to government naturally led the author to turn his microscope away from Rome and antiquity and focus it directly on his own country. He subjects the British Constitution of his time to this exact, rigorous analysis.
Right. So he takes this clinical engineering mindset. He assumes everyone in Parliament is a self-interested knave. He understands that all their power is just a fragile web of opinion. And he looks at the British system. At the time, this was a highly touted mixed government.
Right. A blend of different forms.
It wasn't a pure monarchy nor a pure republic. It had a king, an aristocratic House of Lords, and a democratic House of Commons. And his analysis leads him to some conclusions that I imagine made both sides of the political aisle absolutely furious.
Oh, highly controversial. Because he looks past the lofty rhetoric and examines the raw balance of power. In the British mixed system, the House of Commons, the elected representatives, holds the ultimate power of the purse. They control the taxation and the funding.
Always the most important power.
Always. The king technically has a royal veto over legislation, but the author astutely notes that the royal veto is basically just a theatrical formality. It was rarely ever used because doing so would cause a constitutional crisis. Because the Commons completely controls the money supply to the state, the author realizes that structurally, mathematically, the Commons has the power to absolutely swallow the other branches. At any moment, they can simply refuse to fund the military, refuse to pay the judges, and refuse to fund the king's household until the king and the lord surrendered all their remaining authority to the Commons.
Because whoever holds the gold makes the rules. It's an unstoppable point of leverage. So if the Commons had this overwhelming structural advantage, why didn't they just squeeze the king out entirely, establish a total republic, and take all the power for themselves?
This leads us to his most shocking argument, the paradox of corruption.
Okay, here we go.
The author observes the political reality of his day and argues that the only thing keeping the House of Commons from becoming a tyrannical, all-consuming force in destroying the delicate mixed constitution is crown patronage.
Meaning what exactly in practical terms?
Meaning the king and his ministers actively handing out lucrative government jobs, aristocratic titles, church appointments, military commissions, and outright financial favors to the members of parliament.
So,
bribery. It was a massive system of influence. It is essentially legalized, institutionalized bribery.
Yeah.
The fiery opposition politicians of his time, the Country Party, were screaming from the rooftops that this was horrific, immoral corruption that was rotting the soul of British liberty.
Which seems like a fair point.
But our author, sitting back with his cool, detached scientist hat on, says, no, you don't understand the machinery you're living inside. This corruption isn't a bug, it's a structural necessity.
He's saying the bribery is the glue holding the state together.
Yes. He argues it creates a shared, selfish interest between the ambitious knaves in the House of Commons and the Crown. By giving these parliamentarians lucrative jobs that depend on the king's survival, you align their private greed with the preservation of the monarchy. Without that financial influence, the Commons would have no reason not to completely absorb the state, and the Constitution would instantly collapse into an unstable, warring republic.
Okay, I am struggling with the morality of this. I bristle at this defense of political corruption. Isn't the author basically waving a white flag and justifying mass bribery just to keep the government machinery from seizing up?
Some would say so.
Let me use an engineering analogy. It's like looking at an engine that was fundamentally designed incredibly poorly, an engine where one gear, the Commons, is way too massive and is obviously going to crush the other smaller gears.
Right.
And instead of saying, hey, we need to completely redesign this engine and fix the design flaws, the author's saying, no, just pour a massive continuous bucket of grease on it. Just throw endless bribes at the big gear so it slips and doesn't crush us. Doesn't acknowledging that the system needs corruption mean the system is just objectively bad?
That is a very fair, highly principled critique, and it is exactly what his most vocal contemporaries argued. They hated this pragmatism. But the author's response is deeply grounded in reality, he would say. We do not live in a theoretical, perfect utopia drawn on a whiteboard. We live the real messy world with real ambitious humans.
True.
A mathematically perfectly balanced mixed government where the king and the parliament have exactly equal weight without needing to influence each other, might be totally impossible to design in reality because human ambition is fluid and constantly seeking advantages. The grease, as you call it, is the only practical, real-world way to counterbalance the overwhelming financial leverage of the Commons.
So it's just a necessary evil.
He argues it is impossible to legally assign the crown a mathematically perfect degree of constitutional power that will protect it. Therefore, some degree of behind-the-scenes dependence and influence, call it corruption if you want to use moralistic language, is inseparable from the very nature of a mixed constitution.
It is incredibly, almost uncomfortably pragmatic. He is willing to accept a slightly dirty reality over a bloody, perfect revolution.
He is. But he balances this defense of crown influence by fiercely defending another crucial pillar of the system, one that protects the people.
Yeah.
The absolute liberty of the press.
Right. If the king is buying off Parliament, the people need a way to know what is happening. Why does he argue that a free press is so uniquely, structurally vital to a mixed government like Britain's?
To explain this, he employs a fascinating comparative analysis of different regime types. He says that in a pure absolute monarchy, like France at the time, the king actually doesn't need to fear the press as much.
Why not?
Because the king has no jealousy of his people. The ancient laws, traditions, and the opinion of right make everyone accept his absolute rule without question. There are no rival branches of government to compete with.
Makes sense.
On the other end of the spectrum, in a pure republic, like Holland or ancient Rome, the elected magistrates don't give the people much jealousy because the power is rotating and there's no single permanent dominant ruler to fear. But in a mixed government, where you have Republican elements like the Commons, constantly watching the monarchical elements like the king with deep suspicion jealousy is the defining animating feature of the entire state.
The branches are naturally, structurally paranoid about each other.
Exactly. And because the Republican part of the government needs to prevent the crown from using all that grease and patronage to slowly, quietly steal away all the remaining liberty, the press acts as the vital national alarm system. The unbounded, chaotic liberty to print harsh criticisms of the king and his ministers is the only way to rouse the people from their slumber and convey the alarm from one end of the kingdom to the other if the crown starts to overstep its bounds.
But wait, if he is so afraid of human passions and he knows how easily we are whipped up into a frenzy, doesn't he worry that an unbounded, totally free press will just incite violent, destructive riots? I mean, people read incendiary, angry pamphlets and they take to the streets.
This is where his psychological insight shines again. And it is a brilliant observation about media consumption. He argues that the act of reading is a fundamentally neurologically different psychological experience than the act of listening to a demagogue shouting in a crowded town square.
Really? How so?
When a man sits down to read a political pamphlet, he usually reads it alone, in his study or a quiet corner. He reads it coolly. There is no massive sweating crowd physically present from whom he can catch the passion by emotional contagion.
There's no mob energy.
Exactly. He isn't hurried away by the booming energy of a speaker's voice, the theatrical gestures, or the roar of the mob. Even if the words in the pamphlet make him furious, there is no immediate violent resolution presented to him. He can't just throw a rock at the author. He has to sit and think.
So it forces a pause.
Right. So the liberty of the press, while it might cause widespread murmurs and grumbling, is actually very unlikely to spark sudden, violent, popular tumults compared to the ancient Roman orators who could literally whip up a mob into a murderous frenzy in 10 minutes.
That is such an interesting observation about the mechanics of how we consume information. Solitary reading inherently lowers the emotional temperature, though if you apply that logic to today, I wonder what he would think of social media. Because on a smartphone, you are technically reading alone, but the interface artificially surrounds you with a digital mob of millions. You can see the likes, the angry retweets, the real-time outrage. It simulates the Roman town square while you are sitting in your living room.
I suspect he would be terrified by it. He would likely see social media as the absolute worst of both worlds. It combines the massive, kingdom-wide reach of the printing press with the instantaneous emotional contagion and delicacy of passion of the ancient mob. Which brings us to a very provocative, almost fatalistic prediction he makes about the ultimate destiny of this delicate, mixed British Constitution. He calls it the euthanasia of the state.
That is a profoundly ominous phrase, euthanasia of the state.
He was a realist. He acknowledges that all human creations, including governments, must eventually die. Nothing lasts forever. And he poses a hypothetical question. When the British mixed constitution finally dissolves, as it mathematically must eventually, is it better that it ends by transitioning into a popular, pure republic or by collapsing into an absolute monarchy?
Given everything we've discussed about his desire to check ambition and protect liberty, you would naturally assume a philosopher of the Enlightenment would vastly prefer a republic.
You would think so. But he argues the exact opposite, and his reasoning is deeply pragmatic. He says that if the House of Commons ever totally destroyed the monarchy and absorbed all the power, the resulting pure popular government would be an absolute disaster.
Because of the factions?
Exactly. It would immediately fracture into endless, vicious factions. You'd have civil wars at every election, violent convulsions, and economic collapse. The people would suffer terribly under the chaotic tyranny of 100 competing sub-factions, all fighting for the crown.
So what's the alternative?
Therefore, he concludes that after enduring years of this bloody chaos, the exhausted people would eventually seek repose and safety by handing power over to a single, strongman dictator anyway. So if forced to choose the easiest death for the Constitution, he says a slow slide into an absolute monarchy would be the euthanasia, the most peaceful, painless ending compared to the brutal, agonizing, tearing death of a fractured republic.
Wow, he's essentially saying, look, if the ship has taken on too much water and is mathematically guaranteed to sink, let's just quietly hand the wheel to one absolute captain and let him manage the lifeboat, rather than having the entire crew murder each other with axes while we drown.
Exactly. It is a sobering, dark lesson in political moderation. He is explicitly warning the zealous, fiery lovers of liberty not to push too hard. He's telling them, be careful what you wish for. Because if you push the system to the breaking point and destroy the monarchy completely, you won't get utopia. You will get anarchy, followed by a tyranny much worse than the king you deposed.
And the engine that drives that kind of destructive, chaotic republic, the thing that tears the crew apart, is exactly what we are exploring now. This leads us to his analysis of the absolute poison of human society, our tendency to form tribal factions, parties, and sects.
Yes, the author views the great founders of laws and constitutions as the highest heroes of humanity, but he views the founders of political factions as the most detestable villains in history.
Villains.
Absolute villains. Factions subvert the entire purpose of government. They render the best laws impotent, they distort reality, and they make citizens of the same nation who should be neighbors actively hate and plot against each other. And to understand how this poison works, he creates a detailed taxonomy of factions.
Let's break down this taxonomy because it is incredibly useful for looking at our own world. He starts by dividing all human factions into two broad categories, personal factions and real factions. What is the fundamental difference?
Personal factions are essentially based on trivial things, petty personal friendships, or localized animosities. They often arise in very small republics or local city councils. He points out that human beings have such a desperate, hardwired psychological propensity to divide into competing teams that we will literally do it over absolutely nothing.
Over nothing.
Literally nothing. To prove this, he cites the historical example of the Roman and Byzantine empires, where citizens formed incredibly violent, murderous political factions based entirely on the colors of the liveries worn by the chariot racing teams, the greens and the blues.
That is wild. Literally forming massive street gangs, overthrowing emperors, and killing each other in the streets over what amounts to sports fandom.
Exactly. It is the purest, most absurd expression of our tribal instinct. We don't even need a reason to hate the other side. We just need a different color shirt. Then, moving beyond that, you have real factions. These are factions based on actual, tangible differences in society. He further divides real factions into 3 specific types: factions of interest, factions of affection, and factions of principle.
Let's walk through those 3. A faction of interest seems fairly straightforward.
Factions of interest are the most rational, reasonable, and excusable of all human divisions. It is basic economics. The landowning nobility and the working commoners have fundamentally different economic interests. Agricultural farmers and urban merchants have different needs regarding tariffs and trade. They form political parties to protect their wallets and their livelihoods.
That makes sense.
It is expected, calculated selfishness, and a well-designed government can usually negotiate and balance these interests. Next, you have factions of affection. This is when people attach their intense loyalty to a specific family or a highly charismatic leader, regardless of the policies.
Like a cult of personality.
Right. Think of the bloody Wars of the Roses between the houses of York and Lancaster, or the deep loyalty to the exiled Stuart family in his own time. People will die for a bloodline.
Which leaves the 3rd type, and this is the one that seems to genuinely terrify him: factions of principle.
Yes, this is where the author reserves his most intense, bewildered psychological analysis. He views factions of principle, especially those founded on abstract religious doctrines or theoretical political ideals, as the most extraordinary, inexplicable madness in the entirety of human history.
Why does he single out principles as a madness? Shouldn't standing up for a principle be a good thing?
Because unlike factions of interest, where you are fighting over a tangible pot of money and can eventually reach a mathematical compromise, factions of principle are fighting over totally abstract, unprovable thoughts.
You can't compromise on a belief?
Right. He uses a brilliant, vivid analogy to illustrate the absurdity of this. He says, imagine 2 men traveling on the highway. One is going east, the other is going west. They can easily pass each other safely if the road is broad enough.
Okay.
But imagine 2 men reasoning upon opposite abstract principles of religion or political theory. They cannot pass each other. The human mind is so fragile, so insecure, and so desperate for validation that when it encounters another mind holding a contrary abstract opinion, it feels physically shocked. It views the other person's mere thoughts as an existential danger. The existence of the opposing idea feels like an attack on their own reality.
I have to say, this analogy feels like a perfect diagnosis of modern internet culture and highly polarized political discourse.
Doesn't it?
If you look at how people interact online today, they aren't just disagreeing on a practical policy like a faction of interest, arguing about whether a tax rate should be 20% or 25%. They are operating almost entirely as factions of principle. They view the other side's fundamental reality, their core abstract beliefs about society, as a literal existential threat to the universe that must be utterly eradicated.
Exactly.
They can't just pass each other on the highway and wave. They feel a deep psychological compulsion to run the other car off the road and set it on fire.
It's the exact same psychological mechanism operating today, just amplified by technology. And the author traces how this madness of principle is specifically weaponized by what he calls false religion. He breaks down the psychology of false religion into 2 very distinct opposing profiles: superstition and enthusiasm.
Let's unpack these 2 profiles because they dictate how people interact with power.
Right.
What is the psychological engine that drives superstition?
Superstition, he argues, is born out of human fear, melancholy, and a deep depression of spirits. When people feel weak, ignorant, and terrified of unknown evils in the world, disease, famine, death, they feel utterly unworthy to approach the divine themselves. They feel small.
So what do?
So to cope with this terror, they invent elaborate rituals, physical mortifications, and most importantly, they submit completely to a class of priests. They desperately seek out a human mediator to protect them from the angry gods. Therefore, superstition always inevitably leads to the total domination of priests, and it is fundamentally an enemy to civil liberty. It trains the human mind to be tame, abject, obedient, and perfectly willing to accept political tyranny on earth, so long as their souls are protected.
They trade their earthly freedom for a feeling of spiritual security. And what about the opposite? What drives enthusiasm?
Enthusiasm is the exact polar opposite psychological state. It is born not of fear, but of intense pride, presumption, and a warm, bold, overactive imagination. The religious enthusiast feels so completely full of divine inspiration, so chosen by God, that they reject all earthly rituals, all ancient traditions, and all priests. They believe they have a direct, unmediated line to the divine.
That sounds chaotic.
It is. At first, this enthusiasm is incredibly violent, chaotic, and dangerous to the state. Think of the radical, fiery sects during the English Civil War who wanted to tear down the entire social order. They reject all human authority because they answer only to God.
But does it stay that way?
No, and this is his truly brilliant historical insight. Once the initial furious, destructive fire of enthusiasm burns out, it actually becomes a powerful friend to civil liberty. Because the enthusiast has fundamentally rejected the authority of priests, bishops, and established hierarchies, they eventually settle down into a state of fierce independence. They demand free government and religious toleration because they refuse to be ruled by anyone else's dogma.
That is a fascinating psychological life cycle. Superstition makes you a willing slave out of fear, but enthusiasm initially makes you a violent rebel out of pride, only for that rebel to eventually chill out and become a staunch defender of democratic liberty.
Exactly. And the author takes these deep psychological profiles and maps them directly onto the massive political parties of Great Britain in his own era.
Now, just to pause here for you listening, because applying terms like lovers of liberty or lovers of tradition sounds incredibly relevant to our modern years. We want to be crystal clear. We aren't mapping his 18th century analysis onto today's 21st century left or right politics, nor are we endorsing his specific categorizations. We are simply examining how he used his new science of human nature to dissect the Whigs and Tories of his own highly polarized time. We're looking at the historical diagnostic tool, not taking a side.
That is crucial context. And his analysis of those historical parties is incredibly nuanced and, frankly, quite cynical. He observes that the Whig Party was historically driven by a stated love of liberty and a desire to check the king's power. Consequently, they often aligned politically with the religious dissenters, the groups he categorized as enthusiasts.
And the Tories.
The Tory party, on the other hand, was driven by a deep affection for the monarchy, social order, and the Stuart family lineage. They often aligned with the established Episcopal Church, which leaned toward what he might categorize closer to superstition, or at least a deep reverence for established, unquestioned authority. But he notes that the messy reality of human ambition makes absolute hypocrites of everyone eventually.
How so? Did they abandon their principles?
Completely, the moment it was convenient. The Tories had built their entire intellectual brand on theories of passive obedience and absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the king. Yet, when King James II actually threatened their own liberties and their church during the Glorious Revolution, they suddenly found a reason to rebel and overthrow him.
Of course they did.
And the Whigs, who claimed to love pure, unadulterated liberty above all else, were perfectly willing to suspend those liberties, crush opposition, and expand state power at the moment they gained control of the government in order to secure their own rule.
Which loops right back to his fundamental knave maxim. It doesn't matter how lofty or pure your theoretical principles are, when you get power, the group psychology takes over, and everyone acts out of self-interest to maintain that power. They're all just caught in the machinery.
Precisely. The principles become little more than marketing slogans for the underlying pursuit of power.
Which brings us to the final major area of his philosophy. Having exhaustively mapped the mechanics of government, the necessity of influence, and the terrifying psychology of factions, what is the ultimate real-world legacy of this way of thinking? How does this clinical view affect how society progresses? Let's start with his views on commerce and economics, because he makes a very counterintuitive point here that totally flips the conventional wisdom of his time.
He does. In the 18th century, there was a major geopolitical question. Why did trade, banking, and commerce flourish in free, mixed republics like Holland or Great Britain, but severely decay in absolute monarchies like France, despite France having immense natural resources?
The common simplistic assumption was that in a monarchy, private property simply isn't secure, right? People assumed that the king might just arbitrarily seize your wealth, so merchants thought, why bother building a massive business if the crown will just steal it?
Right. It makes sense, but the author says it is empirically false. He points out that private property was actually quite secure in civilized European monarchies like France. The king wasn't running around robbing merchant ships. The real reason commerce decays in absolute monarchies is much more subtle and goes directly back to human psychology. It is what we might call the economics of honor.
The economics of honor. That sounds like a contradiction in terms.
Not in this system. In a traditional monarchy, the entire social structure depends on a rigid hierarchy of birth, aristocratic titles, and nobility. The absolute highest honor a human being can achieve in that society is to hold a noble title or to have a prestigious place at the royal court.
Okay, so where does business fit in?
It doesn't. Because society values titles above all else, the gritty work of commerce, trade, and banking is not considered honorable. It's seen as somewhat vulgar. So what happens psychologically? The moment a French merchant becomes highly successful and accumulates a massive fortune, he doesn't reinvest that capital back into his shipping fleet or his factories to grow the national economy.
He buys a title?
Exactly. He takes his money, completely abandons his trade, and essentially bribes his way into buying a noble title or a sinecure government position just so he can get the social honor and prestige that he deeply craves.
Oh, that is a brilliant observation. The entire social incentive structure is built to siphon off the best business talent. The system literally incentivizes the most successful capitalists to stop doing capitalism the moment they are good at it.
Exactly. It is a psychological drain on the economy, an invisible cap on growth, rather than a physical theft of property by a tyrant.
That shows such a profound, multi-layered understanding of how human incentives actually drive macroeconomics. But interestingly, alongside this highly modern praise of commerce, free trade, and scientific politics, the author harbors a very surprising, almost tragic aesthetic lament. He deeply mourns the decline of eloquence.
Yes, he dedicates an entire fascinating essay to comparing the modern public speakers, the politicians and parliamentarians of his own day, to the legendary ancient orators of Greece and Rome, like Demosthenes and Cicero. And he is deeply, profoundly disappointed by the moderns.
What's wrong with them?
He says modern speakers in parliament or in the courts are essentially just reading dry, logical, highly technical arguments off a piece of paper. They never reached the sublime, earth-shattering, passionate heights of the ancients. The ancient orators could literally move thousands of people to tears. They could inflame an entire nation to declare war, or they could make a hardened, ruthless conqueror like Julius Caesar literally change his mind and drop his papers through the sheer, overwhelming force of their emotional appeals.
Why does he think modern eloquence has become so flat and uninspiring? Did humans just forget how to speak?
He attributes the decline to a few structural changes in society. First, the sheer complexity of modern laws. In ancient Rome or Athens, the laws are relatively simple, and a trial was often just a broad, emotional appeal to the judge's basic sense of equity, morality, and pity.
And
Today, a modern lawyer has to argue strict statutes, centuries of dense precedents, and intricate contractual clauses. You simply cannot weep, tear your garments, and beat your chest while arguing about a subclause in a corporate property deed. You would look completely ridiculous. The technicality of the system crushes the emotion.
That makes sense. What's the second reason?
Second, he blames the superior good sense of modern audiences. Modern people, shaped by the Enlightenment, pride themselves on logic and actively reject blatant emotional manipulation in formal settings. If a politician tries to act like Cicero today, the audience just cringes.
Well, wait, if we look at his entire philosophical project, I have to point out what seems like a massive, glaring contradiction.
What's that?
His entire goal has been to say, we need to reduce politics to a cold, hard science. We need to assume all men are knaves. We need strict institutional checks and balances to prevent chaos. He explicitly wants a calm, rational, stable, somewhat boring state. But simultaneously, he is sitting here mourning the loss of highly emotional, passionate, incredibly manipulative ancient eloquence. Shouldn't a rational, scientifically designed republic want boring, logical speakers? Why on earth would he want emotional demagogues running around if he knows exactly how dangerous a delicacy of passion is to the stability of the state?
You have put your finger on the ultimate unresolved tension in his entire body of work. Analytically, as a scientist of human nature, he knows that cold, procedural, institutional government is much safer and better for human flourishing. But aesthetically, humanistically, he laments the loss of greatness.
He misses the drama.
He does. He recognizes that ancient eloquence was incredibly dangerous. It was the very fuel that powered the mobs that eventually destroyed the Roman Republic. But it was also beautiful. It represented the absolute pinnacle of human genius and capacity. He is deeply torn between the safe, prosperous, somewhat boring reality of modern legalistic government and the sublime, dangerous majesty of ancient human passion. He wants the safety of the modern world, but he mourns the extinguished fire of the ancients.
That is a very poignant, almost melancholic place for a philosopher to find himself. To build a perfectly safe house, but realize you had to board up the windows that let in the most beautiful light. And it leads us to the lasting impact of this work. Because despite his nostalgia for ancient eloquence, his actual method, this unsentimental, mechanistic, highly empirical view of human nature, absolutely won the day.
Completely and totally. This text and the ideas within it became the direct foundational blueprint for modern political science. The idea of treating politics not as a branch of theology, but as an empirical science based on observable data.
The knave maxim.
The pragmatic assumption that men act as knaves in public life. The absolute necessity of balancing competing factions against each other so they neutralize their destructive energy. The profound realization that all state power rests purely on public opinion. These exact concepts heavily influenced the architects of subsequent democratic republics.
Like the United States?
Yes. If you read the Federalist Papers, the founders of the American Constitution, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, were deeply, deeply indebted to these exact ideas. When they talk about checking ambition with ambition and designing institutions that survive the inevitable flaws of human nature rather than relying on the virtue of the leaders, they're pulling directly from this intellectual lineage. He didn't just analyze his world, he provided the instruction manual for building the next one.
Which brings us to our outro and a final, highly provocative thought from the text to leave our listener with.
The author leaves us with a broader contextual realization that is very challenging to modern sensibilities. He warns that the eras of history with the greatest public spirit, the ages we look back on with awe because of their incredible self-sacrificing patriots and civic heroes, are very often the ages of the worst private virtue.
How does that work?
He points out that ancient Rome produced its most legendary, immortal patriots during the exact times it was brutally tearing itself apart in civil wars, and when poisoning, betrayal, and private murder were rampant.
So, when politics completely consumes everything, when every single citizen is intensely, aggressively focused on the fate of the state and the survival of their faction, it usually means the society is in a deep existential crisis. And in that environment, private morality, just being a kind, honest, decent neighbor to the person living next door, is often collapsing.
Exactly. It forces you to ask a very uncomfortable question of your own era. Does living in a highly politicized age where everyone is an activist and a partisan actually make us worse neighbors to each other? Are we actively sacrificing our private decency and our everyday kindness on the fiery altar of our political factions?
That is a heavy, essential question for anyone listening today to mull over as they navigate their own communities. But now it is time to transition to our signature segment. As always, a very clear disclaimer for you listening. The following thought experiments are strictly for entertainment and educational purposes only. We are taking the historical theories we just discussed and pushing them out to their absolute sci-fi extremes to see if they hold up.
I'm ready. Let's stress test the philosophy.
Thought experiment 1, the opinion machine. We talked extensively about the author's profound thesis that all government power rests purely on opinion, specifically the opinion of interest and the opinion of right. If the people lose those opinions, the state falls.
Right.
Now imagine a near future scenario. An advanced, totally ubiquitous algorithmic social network, perhaps even integrated with direct neural interfaces, can perfectly, mathematically track, map, and subtly manipulate these two opinions in a population in real time.
Oh, wow.
The algorithm knows exactly what article, what video, what subtle digital nudge will adjust the underlying opinions that make people obey the state. If a government can perfectly dial those opinions up or down to prevent any rebellion before it even forms in the conscious mind, do physical laws and police forces become entirely obsolete? Does the state cease to be a physical entity and just become a psychological algorithm managing our hallucination?
That is utterly terrifying, largely because it takes the author's premise to its logical absolute terminus. If he is right, and power is only opinion, then the ultimate weapon of the state is not a nuclear bomb or a standing army. It is the absolute granular control of opinion.
Right.
If the algorithm can perpetually, flawlessly sustain the hallucination of the opinion of right, you literally do not need physical prisons. The prison is the perfectly managed, inescapable architecture inside the citizen's own head. You would have a perfectly stable state, a flawless scientific political machine that would never experience a revolution, but it would be the ultimate invisible tyranny. It proves his point perfectly. Force is always on the side of the governed, so to survive eternally, the governors must fundamentally hack the minds of the governed. It is the dark side of a perfect political science.
It makes you wonder how close we already are to the early prototypes of that machine. Okay, thought experiment 2. The euthanasia protocol. This tests his incredibly dark claim that a peaceful slide into absolute monarchy is the easiest death for a fractured republic. Imagine a highly complex, advanced modern democracy that entirely, hopelessly gridlocks due to the extreme factions of principle the author described. The legislature is completely paralyzed for years, the economy is collapsing, and violent civil strife is endless. The people are exhausted.
A total breakdown.
Yes. Faced with this unbearable agony, would a modern society rationally and peacefully vote to hand over all executive sovereign power to a hyper-efficient, benevolent artificial intelligence? Would an AI sovereign, an entity that doesn't have human passions, vanity, or greed, be the ultimate euthanasia for a deadlocked constitution?
That is the exact tragic scenario he predicted, simply replacing a biological human king with an artificial intelligence. He argued that people will eventually prefer the quiet repose and safety of an absolute monarch to the endless, bloody convulsions of a hyper-factionalized republic. We crave stability over chaos.
And an AI wouldn't be corrupt.
An AI would, theoretically, be the perfect absolute monarch, because it wouldn't be subject to the knave maxim. It wouldn't steal public funds to buy palaces. The society would willingly, enthusiastically surrender its liberty and its right to vote just to stop the fighting and get the trains running on time. It would be the literal euthanasia of the state. A peaceful, pain-free slipping away into algorithmic autocracy, welcomed with open arms by a public entirely exhausted by the toxic consequences of their own unmanageable passions.
It really makes you look at political gridlock in a very different, much more precarious way. Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. We want to thank you, our listener, for pulling up a chair and joining us at the table for this exploration. We encourage you to look around your own life this week and critically examine the opinions you hold that govern your actions. Are they truly yours, born of a delicacy of taste? Or are they just the machinery of the state, the algorithm, and your factions working exactly as designed?
It has been an absolute privilege to unpack these muddy waters with you.
As you go back out into the world, remember that the perfect, clean X-ray machine for human society simply doesn't exist. The waters of human nature will always be murky, driven by pride, fear, and opinion. But once you understand the hidden currents of human passion, the extreme fragility of public opinion, and the predictable mathematics of our own selfishness, you might just realize that the murky shape you are looking at isn't a broken bone at all. It is the intricate, functioning blueprint of the world you live in. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.